Understanding the history of the Bible can be important. It not only helps us understand where the Bible came from, but the process that shaped it. However, it's a history that most people get wrong, and by getting this history wrong, any point they may be making is greatly reduced, if not destroyed. For instance, let's look at an argument.
This is a list of all the Bibles that came before the King James Version.
So no, this isn't a list of all the Bibles that preceded the King James Version, and in fact, many of these wouldn't even be considered the Bible. For instance, while one could kind of say that the Tanakh, the Hebrew scripture, is the Jewish Bible, or something along those lines, it's not the Bible. That's not minimizing the Hebrew scripture, it's just making a distinction. The same would go for the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Tanakh, or kind of, because if we compare the Tanakh with the Septuagint, we do find some additional works within the Septuagint that are not found in the Tanakh. Unlike the Tanakh, the Septuagint kept a number of Greek texts within its collections. We then have Aramaic Targums, which became necessary once Aramaic became the common tongue. And then we must also realize that different Jewish sects seemingly viewed Hebrew scripture differently, as in, what they considered scripture changed between the groups. So it'd be more accurate to say that prior to Rabbinic Judaism, we had multiple collections of Hebrew scripture. This would be similar to what we see with the New Testament Greek manuscripts. We would have a variety of canons that would be created as early as the 2nd century. Marcion is often credited with starting this process when he created his own canon, but he only included an edited version of the Gospel of Luke and 10 letters of Paul. For the next 2 centuries, we would have an evolving canon, but it wouldn't be fair to call these Bibles, as they weren't that. By the end of the 3rd century, this would largely be ironed out, and around this time we would get the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, which were 4th century Greek manuscripts of the Bible. These could most definitely be termed Bibles, as could the Latin Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Bible. So it's really not until the 4th century that we really start seeing something that really resembles the Bible that we have today. And then we have a variety of other translations that are happening around this time period, which is from between the 4th and 6th century, which includes the Ethiopian Bible, as well as translations in Syriac, Armenian, Georgian, as well as Old Nubian, among a handful of other ones. From there, it kind of ran wild. Prior to the King James Version, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different translations. We have translations in most of the major European languages throughout the Middle Ages and into the Reformation period, as well as translations in a number of Asian languages, including that of the Tartars. Now, it's understandable that not all of these are listed, but there are some that probably deserve to be mentioned. For instance, Willem Tyndale was never able to finish his translation. It would later be completed by Miles Cloverdale and published as the Matthew Bible, which was the first complete English translation. We also shouldn't forget the Great Bible of 1538, which was an attempt to be an authoritative English Bible for the Church of England. This is a feat that the King James Version would eventually succeed at. This isn't even an exhaustive list. The process of translating the Bible throughout the millennia that separates the Vulgate and the King James Version is fascinating and filled with a wealth of different translations of various configurations of the Bible. So the problem here is that if even I haven't given an exhaustive list, and I've covered many more Bibles than he has, for him to say that this is all the Bibles that precede the King James Version cannot possibly be true. Now I'm sure some will think that I'm just splitting hairs, but there are 2 things there. First, if he would have shown a larger list, his overall argument would have been even more solid, as it would have shown that the King James Version is just one translation in a massive, overwhelming list of translations. Second, stating a false claim here, he is not only spreading misinformation, as there are certainly those who will keep this list in mind and use it in their own debates or just to share, but he also creates a massive hole in his argument which allows it to be easily dismissed. The point is that we have to be more careful in our claims. We have to do proper research and be sure that what we're saying is actually historical. If we want to make a point to create an argument, we need to be informed. But let's move on.
The Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint both existed during the life of the apostles and Jesus' earthly ministry.
This seems like an odd claim. It's technically true, but it also doesn't mean much. The Tanakh and the Septuagint were around during the 1st century. The books that comprised these collections had been around much longer, But as already discussed, this wasn't the Bible. Eventually, these books would be included in the Bible, yet there's still a distinction. The inclusion of this point appears to be an attempt to make their argument seem more persuasive than it really is. It's a hollow point that is made to look like an actual structure, but instead just fills up space. It's points like this that we need to avoid, as they really are nothing more than artificial fluff.
This follows with the New Testament Greek manuscripts which circulated on their own.
So this is just more artificial fluff. While the Tanakh and the Septuagint were actual collections, we break from even that when just mentioning New Testament Greek manuscripts, because here we aren't talking about anything that even resembles the Bible. Instead, the earliest New Testament manuscripts were letters being sent to churches. These were individual texts that wouldn't be collected into something resembling a canon for nearly a century. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't have earlier collections. 2 Peter 3 seems to suggest that there were collections of Paul's letters and that they were held in high regard. It's also possible the texts had been collected by Paul himself. Timothy N. Mitchell in Myths About Autographs, What They Were and How Long They May Have Survived, states, quote, "In the time of Paul in the 1st century, it was common practice for a copy to be made of a letter before it was dispatched and retained in the sender's archives. From these archived copies, if the author was famous or influential, a collection of letters might be gathered, edited, and circulated as a literary unit." Unquote. This still fails to rise to the level of being the Bible, but it does help show the fascinating history behind the formation of the New Testament canon and the Bible as a whole.
Then, the Bible was canonized, and the first main Bible was the Latin Vulgate.
Was the Latin Vulgate the first main Bible? No. So this gets a little tricky, because the Vulgate would eventually become the official Latin Bible, but that wouldn't be until the Council of Trent, which was held between 1545 and 1563. Even then, the Vulgate wouldn't receive an official edition until 1590 with the Sistine Vulgate. This would be short-lived, as in 1592 it was replaced with the Sixto-Clementine Vulgate. But let's bring it back a little bit. The Vulgate was commissioned in 382. This is the same year as the Council of Rome, which seemingly produced a canon list that matches the one given at the Council of Trent and is used by the Catholic Church. There is debate about this though, as we just don't really have direct documentation of it. It wouldn't actually be until the Council of Hippo in 393 that we really get more of an, quote-unquote official canon. This would then be reaffirmed during the Council of Carthage in 397. This is something here that we should keep in mind though. The exact happenings of these councils isn't fully known. There's a good amount of debate here, largely because we lack actual documentation. And it's not just these councils, but really all of the early councils that we lack a lot of good historical data about them. Now, like I said though, this gets a bit tricky, and it does so on two fronts. So first, let's stick with the idea of a recognized canon. 393 AD is probably the year here that we get somewhat of an official list. However, in 367 we have the 39th Festal Letter of Athanasius, which lists the 27 books of the New Testament and sticks with Jewish tradition for the Old Testament. Is it safe to say this is the first complete list of the canon though? Well, not quite. So what we really are considering here is a confirmation of the 27 books of the New Testament as the Old Testament developed within Judaism. We also have to remember that we are missing a lot of early Christian writings. So when we look at Athanasius in 367, what we are looking at is the most clear, extant list. But we can actually push this back a little bit. Jumping back to 350, we have Cyril of Jerusalem, who lists 27 books of the New Testament. Cyril leaves off the book of Revelation, so we are almost there, but if we actually jump back to 330 to Eusebius, we are told that the Apocalypse of John, also known as Revelation, is disputed. Some churches accept it, while others reject it. Speaking of Eusebius here, he does break down what the various positions on the canon were. He lists books that were universally accepted, which were the 4 Gospels, Paul's letters, which he includes Hebrews with, 1 John, 1 Peter, and Revelation. He does admit that Revelation is disputed by some though. He also lists books that were disputed but recognized by many as canon. These include James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 John, and 3 John. So within these two lists, we have the New Testament books. We can go back a little bit further though, to Origen, around 230. There's some debate here, but it appears that Origen produced a canon list that includes our 27 books. Now, he doesn't specifically state 2nd and 3rd John, but he mentions that he has epistles, plural. He also doesn't list Revelation in his homilies on Joshua, where he breaks down the canon list, but he does express that it should be canon in other places. So it's not necessarily a direct hit, but it's also not necessarily a miss. Finally, we should probably also mention the Muratorian fragment from around 170. As the name implies, this is just a fragment, a damaged fragment of a poor Latin translation of a Greek original. So we aren't fully certain what is there, but we can be certain it contained most of the texts of our modern canon. It also contains a couple of other texts though, such as the Apocalypse of Peter and the Book of Wisdom. It should be clear, though, that the canon was established long before it was officialized, though, and it was established long before Jerome, which brings us to the second part here. So in 382, Jerome is commissioned to produce a work that becomes known as the Vulgate. What he's actually commissioned to do, though, was to revise the Vitas Latina Gospels, which were earlier Latin translations of the Gospels. From there, Jerome, on his own initiative, decided to extend this work and begin to revise additional Vitas Latinia texts, as well as translate most of the books of the Bible. Most is a key word here, as the Vulgate, while often attributed to just Jerome, wasn't just completed by Jerome. It's more of a composite collection, as while it does contain work by Jerome, it also contains the Vitas Latinia texts that preceded him. While Jerome would revise some of these texts, some would also be included as is. So the Vulgate is a bit more complicated than simply having been written by Jerome, and as we see, there are a number of texts that preceded it. Not to mention that the Vulgate wouldn't become official until much later. However, we can actually go back a little bit further. Half a century before Jerome received his commission, we have another type of commission, but this time coming from the Emperor Constantine the Great. We must be careful here though. This has nothing to do with the Council of Nicaea. Instead, this occurred in 331 AD when Constantine, writing to Eusebius, commissioned 50 copies of the scripture. To be clear, there's no suggestion that Constantine is dictating what scripture is. He's just requesting 50 copies of it. Meaning, long before Jerome and the Vulgate, we already had Bibles circulating around. Here's the really neat part though. We may actually have a couple of these Bibles that were commissioned by Constantine. While it isn't certain, it is speculated that the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, which are our earliest surviving complete Bibles, were actually part of those commissioned works. When taking all of this together, and I know it's a lot, what we clearly get is that this courageous statement that the Bible was canonized and then the first official Bible, the Vulgate, was produced is not only misleading, but ignores all the fascinating history that goes into this discussion.
That lasted for about 1,000 years.
So just know, the Latin Vulgate didn't remain the official Bible for 1,000 years, nor is it the Bible for the time period. In fact, the Vulgate wouldn't even become the official Latin Bible until the Council of Trent in 1545. For more than a millennia, it would exist alongside many other Bibles. We wouldn't even have an official version of it until just 2 decades before the King James Version was written. And then we could once again jump into the many other Bibles that were produced during this time period and the many different languages that they were translated into. This is why accurate history matters. If one is going to make an argument based on history, they need to know what that history is. Otherwise, the entire thing collapses.
And then in the 14th century, we get the Wycliffe Bible. And then the 16th century, we get the Tinsdale Bible, the Luther Bible, the Geneva Bible, and the Bishop's Bible.
If you've watched this far, then you know I'm going to disagree. Now, instead of rehashing what we've already gone over, I think it may be more important to actually look at some of the important Bibles around this time that didn't make his list. The first is the Gutenberg Bible in 1454. This wouldn't be the first work that Johannes Gutenberg printed, but it was an early one. The Bible was an edition of the Vulgate which contained a number of divergencies. There is the work of Desiderius Aramis, who produced work on the Greek New Testament in 1516. This work would go through multiple revisions and additions, but it would end up forming the basis for the majority of the Textus Receptus, which was used to translate the New Testament by individuals like Martin Luther, William Tyndale, and the translators of the King James Version. We also have Jacob ben Hayim's Mikrat Gedolat, or also known as the Daniel Boomberg Rabbinic Bible, as Boomberg was the printer, from 1525, which included the Masoretic text, an Aramaic translation, and Jewish commentary. It is believed that this work was a source text used by the translators of the King James Version. And we can't forget the Great Bible of 1539, which was the first authorized edition of the Bible in English. It was actually authorized by King Henry VIII of England and would go through 7 editions. At one point, it was the only English version allowed under the king. I would say that these are some of the major Bibles that existed at this time. It's also worth noting that the Tyndale Bible was never completed, and it would later be completed by Miles Cloverdale as the Matthew Bible. So there's just so much that is missing here.
This is all followed up with the King James Bible in AD 1611.
The way that he presents this is as if there's some sort of progression here, but that's not the case. For instance, while Tyndale was probably influenced by John Wycliffe's Bible, there wasn't actually a progression here. Wycliffe relied on the Latin while Tyndale worked from the Greek. Tyndale was also probably inspired by Martin Luther's German New Testament. Both individuals would actually then use the work of Aramis as part of their textual basis. But to make matters a bit more complicated, Luther's translation wasn't the first in German, so he was working in a different tradition himself. That includes at least 19 complete printed German Bible editions. And then on top of this, we would have Ulrich Zwingli and Leo Judd, who would release a Swiss German Bible called the Zurich Bible. This would be a revision of Luther's New Testament, along with the Old Testament that was derived from the translation of Ludwig Hatzler and Hans Denk in 1527. Just to add some added complication here, Zwingli would actually complete his complete Bible before Luther did by 4 years. Then there were even more revisions of Luther's New Testament, including a Catholic one in 1526. But this line doesn't really connect with the King James Version. We can go back to Tyndale, whose work would be completed in the Matthew Bible. This would somewhat give way to the Great Bible, at least for the New Testament, but Miles Cloverdale would translate parts of the Old Testament from the Latin Vulgate and German translations. Following the Great Bible, which again was a significant translation, came the Geneva Bible. But it's not a straightforward line. Instead, we once again go back to Tyndale's Bible. The Geneva Bible was indebted to the work of Tyndale and would continue the process of translating the text from the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. This would actually make the Geneva Bible as the first English translation to do such. Next would come the Bishop's Bible, but again, we don't see a straight line. And I know I've repeated that quite a bit, but it's something we really have to keep in mind. Instead, the Bishop's Bible was largely a response to the Geneva Bible, which was seen as thoroughly Calvinistic. In this way, the Bishop's Bible didn't build on the Geneva Bible, but it was meant to replace it. But as with the Geneva Bible, the goal was to translate the text from the original languages. Now, the Bishop's Bible didn't fully succeed on this matter, though. The Apocrypha was largely adapted from the Great Bible, and in turn, the Great Bible had translated these texts from the Latin Vulgate. So it was close, but not quite there. Finally, we do get to the King James Version, but again, and this is probably the last time I'm going to say this, we don't see a straight line. A big reason for the King James Version was because problems that had been detected in prior translations. The goal was to translate from the original languages, and to do this for the New Testament, the Textus Receptus was used, which derived from Aramis, while the Old Testament, it came from the Masoretic text, which was largely the work of Jacob ben Hayim. Then for the Apocrypha, it came from the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate. In addition to this, the Bishop's Bible was supposed to be the primary guide for the translators, but it really went back to Tyndale. So we don't have a progression here. The King James Version didn't follow up these other works. Instead, we have multiple threads here. And really, many of these Bibles go back to Tyndale's incomplete translation, which various individuals or groups attempted to build on for differing reasons. Probably worse here, though, is that this creator could have actually built up a better case for his argument that the King James Version isn't the final work. All that he had to do was actually focus more on the Textus Receptus and its shortcomings. There's just so much here that could have been used as a history of the Bible is just amazing. But instead, they choose a path that was rather misleading.
And this is important to note because there are some that treat the King James Version as the standard.
I don't think that this is necessary of importance to note, at least not the way he structured it. Because if we take the view that there was a progression up to the King James Version, one could argue that it was built upon the shoulders of giants and finally came together after much study and consideration. After all, the King James Version had a lot going for it. It was based on largely the best manuscripts of that time. It was compiled by a committee that was intent on fixing the perceived problems of prior translations. It was attempting to translate the text from the original languages, and it was building off the work of previous translators. If we see this as a straightforward progression, that it is building off of prior texts, one can argue that the King James Version was the pinnacle of this endeavor, and thus it should be considered as the standard. The fact that prior Bible translations came before it doesn't change that view. It only helps build it up. But what could counter such an idea is the fact that there was no progression, but a continual attempt to translate the text in a variety of languages, that there were continual attempts to fix prior translations and competing views as to what the text should read. It wasn't a line moving forward, but a jumble of traditions that sometimes worked together and other times worked against each other. But more so, there are major problems with the Textus Receptus that many of these Bibles were based on. While it was good for its time, many better manuscripts have since been found. There are also places where Aramis lacked the Greek and instead back-translated from the Latin into the Greek, meaning there are places in the Textus Receptus that aren't based on Greek manuscripts. There are also cases of where the Textus Receptus takes a minority reading, as opposed to the reading supported by most Greek manuscripts. It also contains printing errors that became part of the text. One can make a good case against the King James Version, but the argument here just isn't it.
Rather than being forced to try to understand Latin, because again, the main Bible prior to this is the Latin Vulgate.
And this just finishes up on a bad note. The main Bible was not the Vulgate. It wouldn't even become the official Latin version until around the time of the King James Version. And again, it was just 20 years before the King James Version that we get a standard edition of the Vulgate. Instead, throughout the 1200 years or so between the Vulgate and the King James Version, we have hundreds of different translations which allowed those who could read it in their native languages. The King James Version didn't change that. It didn't even come close to that. It was just one of many different English versions. What's more though, this ignores all the other languages in which the Bible has been translated to at that time, which seems crazy as he even acknowledges the Luther Bible, which was a German translation. There were also translations in French, Spanish, Polish, Dutch, Italian, Czech, Hungarian, Slavic, and a whole host of other translations at that same time. His argument is way too English-centered, which just destroys it. There were so many paths that he could have taken with this argument, and I know my path, which may be heavy on the historic background, probably wouldn't have been the ideal one for him. But either way, actually getting the history right is necessary, because when you get the history so wrong, and then finish up on such a low note, any argument you may have been building up will fail. But hey, I got to speak about the history of the Bible, which was fun. And if you like this type of material, give me a subscribe, hit the follow button, do whatever, and we'll see you in the next video.